Hello and welcome to episode 29 of the Trueish podcast. Today we're going to talk about defense. Now, some of you may have noticed that since the All-Star break, scoring has actually gone down a little bit. And that's because over the course of the season, we've had a lot of conversations about defense in the NBA and how non-existent it feels. Remember when Embiid and Luka went off for 70 and everyone got their panties in a bunch about defense in the NBA? And then again at the All-Star break, because the All-Star game has no defense. Well, the NBA competition committee, they got together, they started scheming, started brainstorming, and they said, let's stop calling ticky-tack fouls. And they kind of didn't say anything out loud. It wasn't until a couple weeks afterwards that we actually figured out that this even happened, that reports came out that the competition committee came out and made these changes, told the refs to start letting some stuff go. So I'd figured I'd make a video about how I feel about defense in the NBA and the discourse surrounding defense today, because a lot of it is clouded in stuff that just isn't true. There are a lot of things that people believe about defense, a lot of things that people say about defense in the NBA that actually aren't true. If you actually watch the games and look at the numbers, it paints a different picture than what maybe you hear on Twitter or from some of your favorite talking heads. So let's go through some of them, surely. So one I hear a lot, and it always irks me, is they call too many fouls in today's game. You hear a lot of people say that. Similarly, they say there's too many free throws in today's game. And both of these statements are actually completely false. This season, teams in the NBA on average are shooting 22 free throws per game, which is the second lowest free throws attempted per game in NBA history. The lowest, to be exact, was 21.9, and that was 2 years ago. Personal fouls, let's see about that too. This season, teams are averaging about 19 personal fouls per game, which is also, you guessed it, the lowest in NBA history. Now, there are some stars like Harden, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Giannis, and Embiid, who shoot a lot of free throws per game. And that is true. You know, they are great at foul baiting and abusing the rules to try to get themselves to the free throw line to get easy buckets. That's all true. But this notion that defense has been phased out of the game and that scoring is up because of fouls and free throw attempts alone is a false narrative. It just simply isn't true. I always hear people bring up that they want 90s defense back. Do you? Do you really? There's a lot of myths about this physical 90s defense. Sure, there weren't any flagrant fouls to the extent that we get today. There wasn't, the getting under shooters, that type of foul, there was that being a flagrant. That didn't exist, of course. But even though it was more physical, they still called more fouls. In 1990, teams shot on average 29 free throws a game. And it hovered around 26 to 28 free throws per game for the entire decade. Now, the 90s was a low-scoring era, yet they shot 6 to 7 more free throws per game. Why is that? The era where players were allowed to play more defense had more free throws and more fouls? That doesn't make sense, right? That's what we hear all this time, that it was more physical and that, they were allowed to play defense. Well, the defense was still giving up fouls. So let's examine this. What has really happened to defense in the NBA? Why is scoring up so much? The explosion of the three-point shot. That has changed the game and how it can be defended. Combine that with the NBA today being a lot more talented than it's ever been in its history, and that has made defense incredibly difficult to play. From a schematic perspective, especially, offense has evolved over the past 10 to 15 years, while defense, for the most part, hasn't. And the NBA, so much of teams' offense comes from their star players, many of which simply cannot be stopped one-on-one. There's no stopping Luka Doncic one-on-one, which is why he is the most blitzed player in the NBA this season. And the game he had 70, guess what? Atlanta, who blitzes the most in the NBA, decided, let's not blitz Luka. And what happened? He had 73. And that's why he's putting the numbers that he's putting up, because he is so great. He makes the reads that if you do blitz him, if you do try to double him, he's going to find the right man. He's going to make the right read. It's why there's certain players in this league you just cannot double. And that's why they kill you. You can't double Jokic. You can't double LeBron. You can't double Trey. You can't double Luka Doncic. There's just certain players you can't, because they will make the defense pay. And let's expand on this, because the three-point shot has changed the way you can defend in the NBA. Now, why is that? And that's pretty much because every team has lineups. where they run at least, at the very minimum, 3. And most times they have 4, and even sometimes they have 5 guys on the floor who can all shoot the 3 well. What that does is it spaces the floor. If you go back and watch basketball in the 90s, there weren't many shooters. Of course, there was a handful of them in the league, and most contenders had 1 or 2. You know, your Chris Mullins, your Jeff Hornaceks, Larry Bird in the 80s was a good three-point shooter, even though he didn't shoot it at volume. Your Steve Kerrs, your Tim Leglers. Like, there was guys that could shoot the 3, but they were specialists. The 90s was dominated by bigs. Most offense ran through bigs, and most offense function to get layups and get shots close to the basket. Think of all the great bigs at the time. You had Hakeem, you had David Robinson, you had Shaq, you had Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing, Karl Malone, and a bunch more. Offense just functioned differently back then to what it does now. It's almost a completely different game. You could get away with packing the paint in the 90s because there was very little threats from the perimeter, and that is not the case today. That's why in the late 80s, people were skeptical whether the Bulls could win a title with Jordan as their best teammate because they didn't play offense the same way as everybody else. Turns out they were ahead of the curve, and they were able to build a great team defensively as well around Jordan and allowed him to play to his strengths. But it was a complete difference than what the rest of the league was trying to do. Now, today, it's the complete opposite. You need elite perimeter talent to be able to win a championship. The most valuable piece, the most valuable archetype in the NBA right now is the 3 and D forwards or guards, like guys who can shoot the 3 and play defense and are dominant on the perimeter. That's probably the most valuable archetype of NBA player today. You could play a long time in this league and make a lot of money just by doing those 2 things, being a good defender and shooting the 3 and being able to do both of those things very well. Now, with all the shooting and teams shooting 30 to 40 three-pointers a game, you have to get out to the line to contest. What happens then is the paint is open most times, and because the defense is so spread out, it's easier to get good shots. The second there's a defensive breakdown, you're going to give up either a wide open 3 or an uncontested layup. And it has now become incredibly difficult to stop today's offenses, especially with the talent that's in the league. And it's been trending this way for quite some time. Each season for the last 8 years, the NBA, a team in the NBA, has set the record for the highest offensive rating. The Celtics are likely going to set a new record this season with their offensive rating, and a few teams this season are going to be among the best offensive ratings in NBA history. I haven't even mentioned the pace of the game today. We are in a climax of the pace and space era. Not only in the 90s was it low scoring because of the lack of shooting and the lack of space, but it also was because of the pace. Now, pace is on average how many possessions you get per game. So starting in 89, you know, the Detroit Pistons era, we're getting into the 90s, pace started to gradually decrease. Pace was 99 in 1990, which was about 99 possessions per game for a team. And it got down to the high 80s over the course of the 90s, and then continued like that into the 2000s, which is why you hear some people call the early 2000s, especially the dead ball era, because there was so much half-court offense, the game was really slow, and that's why a lot of guys from that era don't have high shooting percentages, because a lot of them are taking tough shots. So it hovered around 90, you know, the pace, up until 2015, 2016. What happened that season? We witnessed the 73-9 Golden State Warriors, and they're a team that's very important when you examine the course of offense in the league. They are what cemented, they weren't exactly the start, but they were what cemented the style of play that you see today. Pace now in the NBA is around 100, so it's comparable to what it was in the 80s, which was also a high-scoring era of a lot of up and down basketball. So high pace, plus a lot of threes taken, plus insane talent, especially with the superstars in the league, equals high scoring. Now, does overall defensive effort and defensive IQ play a part in all this? Yes, I think there is a conversation to be had about the overall defensive IQ of players, especially the ones coming into the league now, and that mostly is a criticism on youth basketball in America and the AAU system and what we're valuing the most when it comes to the development of these players. That is a whole separate conversation you can have, and maybe that attributes to a lot of what we see about defense in the NBA, that a lot of guys come, their first real lessons in defense doesn't come until college, and a lot of that will have to do with what school they go to and who they're coached by, and that is very vital. And a lot of dudes come into the NBA not knowing how to defend, and that's a really big problem, and that's what can bring down the overall defense that you see in the NBA. But there are people, some of which you probably listen to on a daily basis, that have convinced you that calling less fouls and allowing players to hand check, or whatever the case may be, is going to dramatically drive down scoring. It just won't. That's not how it will work. We're seeing it right now. We're seeing it live in living color. Games have been officiated differently since the All-Star break. They're allowing a lot more to go. Just last night, today is Thursday. Wednesday night, we saw a game against the Sixers and Clippers. Came down to the last seconds. Kelly Oubre attempted a layup, and Paul George fouled him, but, it was kind of a, close play. It's at the end of the game. Kelly Oubre's shot wouldn't have counted anyway, even if he got it off. But it's possible he got fouled by Paul George, and they let it go. Scoring across the league is only down 4 points per game since they made this change in the All-Star break. Pre-All-Star game, NBA teams were averaging 115 points per game, which is nuts. That's a lot of points on average. It's down to just 111 now. Not that big of a difference. If you ask me how the NBA can dial back the scoring, I think there's several answers, but I'm not really sure which one you really go with. First of all, I don't see why the NBA would want to. They are probably making the most money than they ever had in the league's history. Most sports are trying to increase scoring and help the game flow faster. You saw Major League Baseball, which today's opening day, implemented the pitch clock last season to try and speed up the game. And what happened is it took some time for players to adjust, pitchers particularly, and scoring was up in MLB last season, at least for the first half of the season. You just saw the NFL earlier last week, get rid of the traditional kickoff. They're going with the XFL kickoff, and that's going to promote more punt returns, more kickoff returns. That's going to drive scoring. That's a little less defense. They also got rid of hip tackling, which is going to hurt defense and up scoring most likely. And that's already with the style of the gunslinging we see from quarterbacks today. So for the NBA to go in the opposite direction of that would be, I don't think it'd be that smart. Plus, the only way you slow scoring down is by slowing the pace down, which, believe me, you do not want. You do not want more fouls called. You do not want more free throws. That's not what you want. You can complain about the style of the NBA today, but believe me, you do not want to go back to the 90s. Believe me, look up articles from that time from reporters and columnists covering the NBA. They talked about how boring the NBA was and that the regular season was a problem and that the playoffs was really the only exciting basketball there was. It's similar to what you hear today. It's just for different reasons. Somehow you could try and limit the threes. I just don't know how you would do that. Maybe a new wave of dominant bigs could change that, but we have some dominant bigs in today's league right now with Jokic, Giannis, Embiid, Victor Wembanyama on the come up. But most of those guys all shoot threes except for Giannis, and they play from the perimeter as well. It's a different breed of big, which is why you've seen the archetype of, the rim protecting, dominant, post-up bigs kind of vanish from the NBA. The only answer would be to somehow limit the threes, and you'd have to change the rules to probably do something like that. And that's always a slippery slope when you start changing rules. There's always the basketball purists that are going to hate it and say that, basketball's not the same. But I'm sure the competition committee is going to spend time this offseason. They're going to see how these changes continue to affect the NBA season. There's about 10 games left in the regular season. They're going to see what the playoffs looks like. Maybe they keep it this way or they turn it up a little more and see how people respond to that, how the players and fans alike respond to the officiating in the playoffs. Because there's no secret that the NBA has officiating issues. It's really tough to fix. And I've heard people mention the defensive 3 seconds rule, how FIBA doesn't use it, the EuroLeague doesn't use it, most leagues around the world, don't use it. I would be in favor of removing that because it would, cut down on the amount of uncontested layups I think you see at the rim, because constantly you see guys have to tiptoe around the paint. For anyone who may not know, the defensive 3 seconds rule is a defender cannot spend 3 seconds in the paint without guarding anybody. So unless your defender, the player you're guarding, is hovering around the paint, you cannot stand in the paint for longer than 3 seconds. So if you watch games, you'll notice guys that are trying to defend the rim but also are trying to stay with their man and not get called for defensive 3 seconds. They'll be two-nining is what it's called. They'll be constantly going in and out, clearing themselves from the paint so that they don't get defensive 3 seconds called. The league could explore getting rid of that rule. Could they explore tweaking the goaltending rules and adopt the FIBA rule, which is so goaltending in the NBA right now is you can only hit the ball on the way up on a shot arc. So if you shoot a layup and the ball hits the glass first, you can't touch it. If it's on the way down, you can't touch it. In FIBA, which we see in the World Cup, we'll see it in the Olympics this summer. Once the ball touches the rim, it's live. So you can literally jump up and hit the ball off the rim if it's spinning around or if it's bouncing. So like Kawhi Leonard's shot way back in 2019 in the semifinals of the Eastern Conference, when he had that game winner that bounced on the rim like 3-4 times, someone could have jumped up and slapped it against the glass and it wouldn't have counted, and the Sixers would have advanced to the conference finals. That is something I think the NBA should also look into adapting. I mean, if the rest of the world is playing a particular way, why wouldn't the NBA try to play that way as well? Perhaps you can move the three-point line back, which maybe that's the way to go. It's not crazy. In 94 to 97 in the 90s, because scoring was so bad and the game was so boring, they actually moved the three-point line in about 2 feet to try to encourage more players, more teams to utilize the three-point line and shoot threes, and it did work. Attempts went up about 4 attempts per game, went from 12 to 16 per game, and percentage went up from about 33% to 36% for those 3 years. Obviously, they ended up moving it back to what the length is now, but for 3 years, you saw scoring go up a little bit, you saw shooting go up a little bit. Maybe it makes sense now to do the opposite and move it back, 2 feet, 2.5 feet. A lot of guys are shooting it from farther than the line anyway, and it would make three-point shooting a little more of a novelty than it is a requirement. Basically to stay in the NBA, unless you're dominant in one particular thing, you have to be able to shoot the three. If you can lessen the amount of players that are shooting the three at such a high clip, maybe you could, deter some scoring. I've even seen some people suggest redrawing the three-point line so that it ends on the sideline and you remove the corner three. Now that's easily the most radical idea. I don't think you can do that and not get backlash from fans. There's literally an archetype, a skill where players only shoot corner threes, because the corner three is the shortest three and it's the three-pointer that's hit at the highest percentage in the NBA. Like, for example, OG Anunoby, I remember when we traded for him from the Raptors, he was shooting almost 50% on corner threes. Like, that's just a ridiculous percentage to shoot from the three. And it's also a shot you see a lot in transition get hit. It's a big shot. If you remove that, you do probably cut down on some of the attempts from the three-point line. But to me, that's just super radical. I think it would be too much of an adjustment to make. And I don't think that's something the NBA is even going to entertain. It's no small feat to attempt and dramatically change the way the game is played. I mean, while it feels like this happened quickly, it was a gradual change that started several seasons before the Warriors dynasty, but they're definitely what cemented it, and cemented it as the way to contend for titles. Some people give Steph Curry flack that some of his legacy, along with being the greatest three-point shooter ever, is that he changed the NBA for the worse. I don't particularly mind the high volume of three-point shooting, but I do agree that I think defense has to be given a better chance. I mean, defense is just right now, they just have no chance. I mean, if you've heard of the podcast LeBron James and JJ Redick are doing, they're kind of breaking down basketball plays and stuff, really providing great knowledge for the game. They broke down plays on their recent episode that they describe as unguardable. Plays where you basically just have to decide what you're going to give up, and that's how teams play defense today. They have to decide going into games, what are we going to live with? Who are we going to live with killing us? And if teams get hot from three, which happens, you tip your cap. GG's, you lost. Because when a team gets hot from three, literally within 5 minutes, you could be down 2 to down 20. And that's why you also see a lot of leads disappearing really fast. A couple nights ago, Boston blew a 30-point lead to the Atlanta Hawks. They had a 30-point lead, I believe, in the first half, and they ended up losing the game to a Hawks team that's decimated by injury. Stuff like that with the 3-point shot and how you can go hot, you can go really cold. It can really decide the outcome of games, and it even changes. Doesn't matter who the better team is.